Tatum's accomplishments are too many to list here, but in everything she does, she is so clearly a teacher. And for me, as a teacher who came up in the 1990s, what I find personally meaningful is her work from that time, including a study of her own teaching and a course on the psychology of race, and her research on professional development with in-service teachers right here in Greater Boston. Dr. Tatum's work is about the biggest questions, the thorniest issues in America, and it speaks to and about teachers. In the most recent edition of her book, Dr. Tatum concludes, "It has been said that to teach is to touch the future. Helping students see the past more clearly, to understand and communicate with others more fully in the present, and to imagine the future more justly is to transform the world." To transform the world. That's a big responsibility. It sounds like the motto of the teacher education program that I went through in the 1990s, teach to change the world. I recently looked back at my own pre-service teaching journals from that pre-Google era. I was a white teacher, and the people in my classroom were predominantly students of color. And I decided to teach Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison, but I was asking questions like, who am I doing this work? And how am I supposed to do this work? And how am I supposed to change the world when I can barely get my lessons planned and papers graded for tomorrow? So now, when I interview students for admission to our teacher ed program, I don't ask them, how is your teaching going to change the world? I ask, what would teaching for social justice look like in the classroom on a run-of-the-mill Tuesday in second period? And that's what we've asked Dr. Tatum, who with all of her accolades is also a teacher, to help us think about. How do we enact justice in the classroom? And how do we empower students to further that mission every day?
And it says, I remember. This is a memory activity. I want to ask you to take a moment and think about your earliest race-related memory. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to ask you to tell it, right? So you can raise your hand without risk. Tell me if you have thought of something. Okay, most of you have. And now what I really want to know is not what the memory is, but how old you were. So you can tell me by either calling out ages or holding up fingers, your choice. Okay, I've got 5 and 8. I heard, did you say second or 7? Second grade, so that's about 7 maybe. I see some 7s. I've got 2 or 3. 3? Oh, 7. Oh, sorry. Yeah, 7. Okay, and a lot of 7s. So 5's a 10. Anybody older than 10? You won't have enough fingers if you're older than 10. Yes? Is that a yes? How old?
12.
Okay, 12. Anybody younger than 3? No. It looks like most of you are in that 5, 6, 7 range, though not everybody. And so now my question is, what emotion, if any, is attached to this experience? You could just call out some words to describe the feeling attached to the experience. Confusion. Happiness in the context of friendship.
Fear.
Fear. Sadness. We've heard confusion, fear, sadness, and happiness. Anything else? Shame. Curiosity. Anybody got anger? That's a common one. Sometimes people say embarrassment. We have heard a range already, though. Just to reiterate, we've got confusion, fear, sadness, shame, happiness. Did I left something out? Okay. So now my question is, let me just pause there to say most of those words, happiness in the context of friendship is certainly a positive feeling. Most of the other ones we would describe as uncomfortable. in some significant way uncomfortable. So now my question is, I want you to think about whether you had a conversation with a concerned adult at the time that this experience happened, like a parent, a family member, a teacher. Raise your hand if you did. Okay, I think I've got like 6 hands up. Raise your hand if you did not. It's pretty easy to see there are more did nots than there are dids, and some of you are maybe not sure, but I ask these questions a lot, almost always at the beginning of public presentations like this one, and almost always, in fact, I'm trying to think of one time when it wasn't the case, I think really always, there are more people who did not have that conversation than there are who did. How many of you are working with elementary school students right now? Several? And I'm assuming that's because you're planning to be elementary school teachers. Many of you, whether you're an elementary school teacher or not, have had some experience with 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. Am I right? Either babysitting or siblings or children of your own. And there's one thing you can say about children of that age, early elementary school. They're pretty candid. They don't filter much. They blurt stuff out all the time. They don't have those social filters that a lot of us develop over time. So here's my question. If we know that 5, 6, and 7-year-olds are pretty candid, and many of you had these experiences at that time, and it was an uncomfortable experience, one that had a feeling associated like sadness, shame, fear, confusion, how come so many of you didn't talk to anybody about it? What's your hypothesis? Go ahead.
At least in my case, I had brought it up with an adult and I was told not to talk about it.
Okay. So sometimes the subtle cue is don't talk about it. But in your case, it wasn't subtle. It was don't talk about it. And when you got that instruction, what did you do?
From what I remember, I was a very will follow me type child, so I kind of panicked that I brought it up.
You got the clear message, this is something you're not supposed to talk about, right? I want to argue that a lot of people got that message. Maybe not as overtly, but a lot of people have early experiences, as we just saw, and a lot of people didn't talk about it, even though it's an age when people talk about what's on their minds pretty candidly. And I want to argue that it's because we learn, many of us learn at an early age, this is a hot topic, as in a taboo topic, a topic you're not supposed to talk about. And adults in the environment are uncomfortable talking about it and would prefer that you didn't as well. And we didn't hear this, but sometimes people say, well, actually it was the adult that said or did the confusing thing. So the person I might have asked about it was not really going to be able to bring clarity because that was the person who was the source of the confusion. I raise this question, these sets of questions, and get you to think about this because sometimes people say children don't notice race, but you all have a memory in which you did. Something happened in which you noticed, right? And yet the message also is don't talk about it, and maybe even don't notice. Like, could you stop noticing? Don't bring it up. And so when people tell you that children don't notice, or my daughter has all these friends, she never comments on color, she doesn't notice, sometimes I say it may not be that she doesn't notice, it may be that she's learned she's not supposed to mention it, right? We have a lot of information that suggests that it's the silencing of children early on that makes it hard for adults to have these conversations. Not because they're still children, but because they've had years of being reminded that this is something you're not supposed to talk about. And then you ask people to talk about it, and no wonder they have knots in their stomachs, because it's a lot of information, a lot of messages that say, keep quiet. So we're gonna talk about race today, just so you know. And I'm hoping that you will participate in this conversation despite the knot in your stomach. So what's different about the conversation from 1997 to 2017? These are pictures of my book. The first one is an earlier version, and the second one is the 2017 version. So when we think about the last 20 years, people often say, it seems like we're moving backwards. And this is a quote from Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., in his last book before he died. He wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here?, subtitled Chaos or Community. And he said in the book, the line of progress is never straight. The inevitable counter-revolution that succeeds every period of progress is taking place. He was referring to 1968. He was referring to sort of the backlash against the gains of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. But if we think about the progress that was made, culminating in the election of the first African-American president, and the backlash against that election, and what feels like a progressive moment in our history right now, we are reminded by this quote that the line of progress is never straight. It's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so the question is, how do we move forward again? If you came to my talk yesterday, the Gittler Prize talk, I talked a lot about a particular strategy for moving forward. I'm not going to repeat that talk, but simply to say, if there's one thing that history tells us, yes, 2 steps forward, sometimes back, but then there's always a period of moving forward again. And if we think about teaching for social justice, we have to think about teaching for moving forward again. How do we do that? Okay, well here's what I want to say about the cycle, things to remember about it. It's always operating, even if you're not paying attention, right? It's like the earth is always moving, we don't feel it, but it is, and it's impacting us. This cycle is always operating, even if we're not noticing. And it systematically advantages some people. That's the nature of racism. It systematically advantages the dominant group, and it systematically disadvantages others, but everyone is impacted. No one is not touched by it. But this cycle has been operating a long time. It wasn't invented in 2018. It has been operating a long time, and so no one sitting in this room started it. It's not our fault that it has been operating, but it is, I like to use my smog analogy, it's not my fault there's smog in the air, right? I mean, I might have contributed some pollution, but that's certainly not all my fault. And that doesn't mean I don't have a responsibility to try to clean it up. So that's really what we're talking about here in terms of teaching for social justice. The problem didn't start with us, but certainly we have a responsibility to try to change it. The good news is we can. The cycle can be interrupted. The change is possible. But what does it require? So here is what, it requires intentionality. And what we've got here are what are described as the 4 core goals of anti-bias education. Now let me say these 4 core goals come from a book called Anti-Bias Education for Young Children on Ourselves, written by Louise German Sparks and Julie Olson Edwards. Louise German Sparks is an educator who has been doing research and writing about anti-bias education with young children for many years. And her book, Anti-Bias Education, was originally published in the 90s, just like my book was originally. And coincidentally, just like I did a 20th anniversary update, so did she. So this book, Anti-Bias Education for Young Children and Ourselves, came out, I think, in 2016. It's relatively new, it's been completely updated. But she talks about the core goals of anti-bias education for young children, but I like to use it because it's not just for young children. These same goals could be for teenagers. Pre-K through 12, these principles apply. And what they say in the book is that every child, if they have had effective anti-bias education, will be able to do certain things. Listen to these things and see if you think you'd want your kid to do this. Will demonstrate self-awareness, confidence, family pride, and positive social identities. Wouldn't we all want that? Each child will express comfort and joy with human diversity, will have accurate language for human differences, and deep, caring human connections. Sounds good to me. Each child will increasingly recognize unfairness, have language to describe unfairness, and understand that unfairness hurts. Now, unfairness is the language you use with preschoolers, right? Because they don't understand isms, but they do get unfair. His cookie is bigger than mine. That's not fair, right? Kids get that. They will increasingly recognize unfairness. They will demonstrate empowerment and the skills to act with others or alone against prejudice and or discriminatory actions. When they see it, they'll have the tools to interrupt it. Will know what to do and say, or at least have some sense that it's possible to act, either with others or alone, to interrupt that cycle. So if we were doing what we wanted to do effectively in classrooms, we ought to be able to do that. Now, I also talk about, in addition to those 4 goals, what I call the ABCs. Some of you have read about it in the smaller book, Can We Talk About Race? I talk about those ABCs. Affirming identity, building community, cultivating leadership. And so what does that mean in real life? Affirming identity means students need to see themselves reflected in the environment around them. If you've been in my presentations earlier today or yesterday, you've heard me ask this question, but let's imagine there's a photographer up here in the front of the room, and that photographer takes a picture of all of you at this occasion, and you get a copy of that photo on your way out the door. What is the first thing you're going to do when you get your copy? You're going to look for yourself. And that's what affirming identity is all about. It's being able to find yourself. You know, you're going to look for yourself in that picture. And let's imagine that the photographer took great care to make sure you were all arranged so that everybody could be seen. And then you took that photo, and then you got your picture, and yet you were not in it. You've been digitally removed from it. You would be wondering, what's wrong with that picture? But let's imagine that you come to events like this frequently. And frequently there's a photographer that arranges the space and tells everybody, don't leave, I know it's time to go, but stay a few more minutes, we want to take this group photo. And every time you do, you get that photo back, and every time you've been removed from the picture. I don't know how long it would take, but sooner or later somebody's going to say, gather up for the picture, and are you going to hang around? You are not. You are not going to want to participate because you haven't been included. You don't have any confidence that you will be included, and therefore you check out. We walk into schools all the time and see kids who have checked out. They're physically present, but they've checked out. And part of that checking out has to do with not affirming identity. I read a study recently. It was amazing to me that this was not obvious. But the study was, students who are greeted by name at the door perform better than those who are not. It should be obvious that when you walk in the room and a teacher says, hi Beverly, you feel better than if they don't acknowledge you, right? But someone did a study, and sure enough, the students who are acknowledged when they walk in by their names, or properly pronounced by a teacher, perform better in those classrooms. That is an example of affirming identity. We all want to see ourselves reflected and don't want to feel invisible or marginalized. When we feel invisible or marginalized, that undermines our motivation, and lack of motivation undermines student success. Building community requires the A. So everyone How many of you have been at a school where they said, we are one big school family? You know, we are here, we want a shared sense of community, we want to all be on the same team, we have school values, we're all connected. That's great, that's all about building community. But I'm going to tell you that that kind of community building only works if you've paid attention to the A. If you try to build community without being intentional about asking who's missing from this picture, you are not going to have everyone participating. You're going to miss the boat. So what does it say? It says students need to sense that they belong to a larger shared school community. Those who feel that their own needs for affirmation have been met are more willing and able to engage with others across lines of difference. And some people will say, well gosh, if we are creating these opportunities for students of color to gather together separate from their white peers, doesn't that create division within the community? But actually what we see, what research tells us, is that students who feel affirmed in that activity often then are more willing to engage in other things, more willing to engage in other activities that include the larger community. Because they're operating from a position of strength. They feel empowered by that time alone, and then they are more engaged, more willing to be involved, and more engaged academically as well. Cultivating leadership. Leadership in the 21st century requires the ability to interact effectively with others from very different backgrounds. The development of this ability requires practice. I was talking to a group of folks here from Brandeis earlier today, and we were talking about the fact that a lot of people come to college without having had much opportunity to practice. When a lot of you might have had the experience of coming to an institution like Brandeis and finding that it was more diverse than the place you went to high school. Raise your hand if that was true for you. A lot of you. And so, when you come to a place that has more diversity than you were used to, it means you're in an unfamiliar context, right? You have to learn new skills. But you saw my chart about the US population, and of course we're talking just about the US, but the whole world is becoming more diverse. Every country, getting migrants from different parts of the world, the populations are shifting. How do we go from theory to practice? Who is reflected in our environment? That's a question we can all ask. Who's missing from the picture? What opportunities exist in my classroom, in my building, in my school district for building community? What opportunities exist in my classroom, in my building, in my school district for encouraging dialogue across difference? And how are the children I'm responsible for involved so that they are honing leadership skills in a diverse context? Those, I think, are the questions that when you can answer them, you are well on your way to educating for social